Thanks for watching ya teman-teman. Jangan lupa like, comment, and subscribe-nya ya.
And became interested in what was emerging as a functional orientation in sociological thought, largely derivative from the functional work of Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski in anthropology, and deriving, in my opinion, ultimately from Durkheim. And so when I finished my own studies, formal studies as a graduate student, I wanted to develop a formal exposition of what functional analysis amounted to. And in the event, I did. And as was to be the case for the rest of my academic life, I developed it in lectures to students to begin with. So there was the microenvironment to begin with.
Yeah.
I don't know whether the year that you were in the course in which I presented that, do you recall whether I dealt with social structure anatomy?
Oh yes, I first encountered it during that course, 1939.
And that's why I have distinguished between what I call oral publication, which, as the term suggests, means thinking it aloud in the presence of some audience, and printed publication. Publication, by the way, you may think that's an oxymoron. Oral publication seems to clash as a notion, but of course it doesn't. Publicare means to make public, and you can do it in any number of ways, including the current one, which is oral publication going on at this very moment. So how did that end up in SSNA? In my opinion, the following way. I developed something I called a paradigm of functional analysis. Now, this was a quarter century or so before Tom Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions gave a very special and powerful meaning to the notion of paradigm. I had a more limited notion, namely a formal statement of the underlying assumptions, the fundamental concepts, the problematics, and the mode in which this kind of analysis would take course. In doing that, I became powerfully impressed by the way in which functional analysis had centered on functions, on the positive consequences of structures and of actors operating within social structures. And so I turned to the correlative notion of dysfunctions, the notion I took from medicine and biology, and started to look at the dysfunctions, the negative consequences for the structure and for classes of individuals within the structure of anything that was being explored. And so it was when I presented some ideas on bureaucracy. I focused on the dysfunctions of bureaucracy, whereas Max Weber, who of course created the tradition of work in bureaucracy, had only centered on positive functions. When I came to think of social conformity, I said, but what about social deviation, deviant behavior? And again, it was on what seems to be dysfunctional, but I soon concluded that that wasn't the interesting problem, as you know.
Direct observation of them, or direct talking to them, or both, but without using any formal instrument, though they may come in. That's not essential to field research. And this may be done either under the auspices of some outside body, or the company, if that's industrial, or you may do it by what we call participant observation, that is, just going in on your own.
How have you decided to do a field research project in the past? What made it interesting for you to start a project, and when did you feel it was appropriate to pursue a problem that interested you, a theoretical problem in the field?
Well, not so the theoretical problem. It's purely empirical problem. After the war, previous to that, I'd done a lot of research, but after the war, for instance, I thought it was time to do some research on clerical workers, but simply because nobody had done any research on clerical workers.
And what, in your first times you went into the field, what were some of the typical problems you faced, the typical learning experiences, the critical issues, whether they were ethical or the types of skills you had to develop in the field?
Well, actually the first, if you take it, the first field research that I was responsible for was a study of steel workers out in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, who were unemployed. And the problem I ran into was not talking to the steel workers. We'd gotten an introduction to their leaders from the Steel Workers Union, but the fact that stupidly I had said that I was, which I was, from the Harvard Business School. And there was something called the Greater Newcastle Association, which is the Chamber of Commerce, that said, what is this character doing here from the Harvard Business School? And went to back to the Harvard Business School to find out if I was legit.
And what did they find out?
They found out I was legit, but in the meanwhile, they thought that I was a spy of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And Newcastle was in bad shape at that time.
What about your early experiences with Elton Mayo in the Boston VA, was it?
No, it was the then called the Boston Dispensary.
The revolutionary student movements of the 1960s and early 70s termed.
Well, I was not the mentor of the student activists of the 60s and early 70s. What I did is formulate and articulate some ideas and some goals that were in the air at that time. That is about it. The student generation that became active in these years did not need a father figure or a grandfather figure in order to lead them to protest against a society which revealed daily its inequality, injustice, cruelty, and its general destructiveness. They could experience that. They saw it before their own eyes. As features of the society, I only mention the heritage of fascism. Fascism was militarily defeated. The potential for a repetition was still there. I would like to mention racism, sexism, the general insecurity, the pollution of the environment, the degradation of education, the degradation of work, and so on and so on. In other words, what exploded in the 60s and early 70s was a blatant contrast between the tremendous available social wealth and its miserable, destructive, and wasteful use.
And I think one might add, I mean, whether one agrees with your view on any or all of these matters or not, that the prevailing orthodoxies in philosophy in the colleges and universities throughout the West at this time simply didn't deal with these questions at all, did they? Certainly analytic philosophy didn't, positivism didn't, and so on.
They did not. And we in Frankfurt and later in the United States could not conceive of any authentic philosophy which did not in one way or the other reflect the human condition in its concrete situation, the social and political situation, and so on and so on. For us, philosophy has always been, to a great extent,